Hey, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joe Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge. And we are rolling along with what has become, I'm assuming, a 4-part series.
Next episode will complete the 4 parts, right? This is number 3.
That's right. We've been diving into what I would call the nucleus or the center of each of the dichotomies in the Myers-Briggs system. So that might sound real simple, like what's the nucleus difference between introverts and extroverts? We talked about that in the first episode. And then what is the nucleus difference between intuitives and sensors? We talked about that in the last episode. And now we're going to talk about the nucleus difference between thinkers and feelers, meaning what is at the center of all of this? Since each of these dichotomies has a ton of characteristics that gets rolled out with these preferences, then there's got to be something at the center that is kicking over all those dominoes, encouraging all of those characteristics and traits to come out. So this week we want to talk about the thinker-feeler dichotomy split. What is the actual difference between thinkers and feelers?
Just remember, we've been talking about this in every episode. The split is not that you are 100% a feeler or 100% a thinker. You have both thinking and feeling inside of your personality, and that's when we talk about the cognitive functions, or what they're technically called, the way your mind learns information, makes decisions. We all have a feeling part of us. We all have a thinking part of us. This really speaks to what we lead with, what we have as a preference, what we start with. You have the other as part of your personality. So just don't get locked in. If you're a new listener or you're new to type, don't get locked into, well, you're completely a feeler or completely a thinker. You have both of these elements.
Well, and I think a lot of times when people are trying to suss out what their preferences are, they think in terms of, well, I can do both. I can't. I just recently read a comment of a person who is an INP, and they were saying, well, I don't know if I'm an INTP or an INFP because I can do both of these things. And, well, first of all, usually we think we can do those things well until we get in the presence of somebody who's using it as, one of these functions as, say, a dominant or driver cognitive function. And then we go, oh, that's how that is used. But that said, it's not what we can do. It's what we are pre-wired to be compelled to do. That's what we're looking at. So these preferences are preferences in the sense that our mind just naturally organizes around them as a core principle or as like sort of a key way of looking at life. So for thinkers, even though there's a feeling component, and there must be, because otherwise we wouldn't be complete human beings if we only ever thought in thinker terms. So we have to have a feeling component and vice versa. But for thinkers, there's this we feel compelled. I'm going to say we because I'm a thinker as well. I have thinker preferences. We feel compelled to focus or deprioritize the feeling component and hyper-focus on the thinking components. And then for feelers, it would be the opposite. Obviously, all feelers are thoughtful or can be thoughtful, have access to a thinking part of themselves.
I don't know about all feelers are thoughtful.
Right. Well, I'm saying they can.
I don't mean to disrupt your point you're making. I'm just making a joke.
They have the capacity should they choose to pull on it. It's in there. For some, it feels dormant, but the same thing feels, for thinkers, right? It seems the same way. If we're too one-sided, it's like what's in there, you just got to go access it. That said, feelers have the capacity to pull on a thinking component, but their mind is pre-wired to organize around the preference for feeling. So again, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about what we come pre-wired to believe is the most important criteria. Now, when it comes to this dichotomy, Joel, you and I talk about this endlessly.
Yeah.
And I think it's because both of us have ENP preferences. So as two extroverts, we're not diving into the difference between extroversion and introversion in our personal conversations. And we're not diving into the difference between intuition and sensing in our private conversations as much, even though we will talk about ways to integrate our sensing, style. And we're not really talking that much about judgers versus perceivers because we both have perceiving preferences. But the fact that you have feeling preferences and I have thinking preferences, I think is the most obvious difference in styles between the two of us.
Yeah.
And most likely causes the most arguments or fights or conflict. Because when it comes to the other side, it can feel so foreign. Like, I get where you're coming from, but why would you think that's the most important thing?
Well, in the same vein, it's also one of the things I really appreciate about you, because it's so different from how I process things. It's different than how I go through the world to get the thinker's perspective. My hope is that it's a good thing for you too, getting the feeler's perspective from my side, Antonia. And so I really appreciate the fact that this is a differential between us. And I think it's a unique differential too, because in gender stereotypes, typically men are encouraged to be more thinker-like and women are encouraged to be more feeler-like. And so we kind of go against those stereotypes and those expectations just in how we're naturally wired. So I think it's a really cool, unique blend to our dynamic together.
I would agree with that. While it most likely causes the most rifts, I think it also creates some of the deepest appreciation. And, when they talk about things like emotional labor, I've also been considering this concept of thought labor. And I would say that we lean the heaviest on my thought labor and we lean the heaviest on your emotional labor. And I don't just mean emotional labor like it's your job to keep everybody happy, although I do sometimes assign that to you. Like, what? Well, when people are sad, why aren't you making them feel better, Joel? That's your job. But there's a sense of leaning hard, for me anyway, leaning hard on your ability to tap into what a person's intentions and motivations are, the subjective human experience that they're going through, what they're feeling, why they might be feeling that. And I very much rely on that for my own development. Sometimes I'll just look at you and go, I have no idea what I'm feeling. What am I feeling? And you tap into that. And I think I provide a thought labor service as well, which is really getting into the nitty gritty of the distinction making around, issues and concepts and thoughts. But before we go too far into that, let's get to that nucleus of the difference between thinkers and feelers. So last week we talked about sensing and intuition and how they're associated with how we perceive reality. And that's because in cognitive function terms, which are the 8 ways that people are wired to experience the world, in cognitive function terms, they are the basis of what's called the perceiving functions. And so sensing and intuition can't just be understood on their own. They also have to be understood as ways of taking in information. In the same vein, for thinking and feeling, or thinkers and feelers, this is where we get our judgments from. This is where we get our evaluation criteria for making decisions about how things should be set up, what should be important to people. I call it the shoulds of the world. And so at the center of thinking and feeling is decision making. At the center of it is determining the shoulds of the world. How should things, roll out? How should we be setting things up? What is supposed to be important to us? And for feelers, the human experience is at the top of the list. That's the highest priority. How are people experiencing the world, and how is it impacting them or making them feel?
Right. And it's actually split into 2 different ways feelers can show up. And that's where you get into cognitive functions, typically how other people are feeling or how you as the individual is feeling as a feeler. So usually you're attuned to one of those or the other. And that's where those styles of feeling come in that we can talk about a little bit later.
Right. But the dichotomy itself.
That's right.
Right. Separating it from which direction it's pointed towards. At the center of the dichotomy is a prioritization of scanning for how people are being impacted by their experience. On the other side, the thinker side is a focus on or a prioritization of what I would call the systems that support the human experience. So everything else that goes around it, the not just the logistical systems, but the accoutrements of the human experience. So for thinkers, they're always 1 degree removed, or 1 degree of separation removed from what's happening for the person that is going through life, or how people are engaged and interacting with each other. There's a sense of separation because you're taking in not just what's happening to people, but all of the nodes in the system surrounding them, the relationship to things that are not people, the relationship to their environment and the systems in the environment, and the thoughts that are getting implemented in this environment. So it's almost like the paraphernalia of life. So thinkers take into consideration the human component because that's what makes it interesting. Like the ecosystem of life and all the elements in it, like the logistical systems that are set up and the thoughts that get communicated back and forth. they're all interesting because they relate back to humans, and we as thinkers are still having a human experience. So that's what makes them interesting.
So like that whole concept of being the last person on the planet, and you wouldn't need money or cars or any resource because you want all those things for other people. So the moment a thinker was the last person on the planet, they wouldn't need to think of the humans or consider them anymore.
Well, they'd have to think of themselves as a human and build a system for the self, but that would be pretty miserable, I would imagine. But I think that's a great illustration. Like, if you're the last person on Earth, you don't need money anymore, right? You don't need all of these human systems of interaction and engagement. And so that's why when I say thinkers take in the human component and all of these other systems, it's not like they're taking in more information than a feeler necessarily is, and like as a general statement, and I wouldn't even necessarily say it's a quality versus quantity thing. It's like, it's just paying attention to different stuff. It's less of a deep dive into how all things are impacting people, but maybe keeping your finger on the pulse of how it's impacting people in order to build a better system. So if a feeler is paying attention to how a system is impacting a person, they're going to do a much deeper dive into what that person is experiencing, how they're feeling about it, what is going on with them, is this good for them? And a thinker is going to go, you good? Right? Because I'm working on the system, and I'm going to primarily be focused on the system and then checking in with, you good? Whereas the feeler is more likely to go, well, what is your experience? What's happening for you? Let's go a little deeper. And it's just the different lens. It's a different set of priorities on what is important. Now, that's not to say that feelers can't also focus on the systems, right? They very much do, because we have to. As people, we have to set up our lives. We have to set up the systems of our lives. And we want to have elegant systems, because the more elegant the system, the more needs get met, the happier people are. So obviously, feelers think that systems are important. But that's not the main priority. That's not like, if a person is crying and a system is breaking, the person who's crying is going to be way more interesting to the feeler. If there's a person crying and a system breaking, there's going to be a bias for the thinker to pay attention to the system, and maybe even think that the person is crying because the system is broken. So we need both, because these are both elements that impact us deeply as individuals and as a collective, as people who have relationships with each other. So it's like both gates need gatekeepers. Both of these worlds need somebody paying attention to them. And so there's no right or wrong. There's no superior or inferior. There's just, what part of reality do I feel like I'm a steward for to pay attention to?
I think the other part of this too is that both types of people will translate things into the framework that makes sense for them. So as I go through my world as a feeler, for example, and you listening if you're a feeler, information is easier for you to make decisions about if you can put it into a feeling context for yourself. How is this impacting myself or other people? What's the human experience? If it's something that's purely digital and it's hard to translate into a feeling element, it might be hard to make a decision about that. It might be hard to think about that because it can't be put onto your turf or your terms. Flip that to the other side, somebody that's going through the world with thinking preferences is going to want to take even emotional things and turn them into digitizations of information or thought, right? But sometimes that breaks down. Sometimes it's hard for a thinker, if there's feelings around them and they can't translate it into thought to be able to make a good decision about it. They can have a challenge even seeing the emotion or picking up the emotion or the experience of a human because they can't make it digital for the thought side of things. So I think this is the challenge for both thinkers and feelers, is that we want to put it onto our terms to evaluate it. And so we miss information, like we just don't see it, or we don't perceive it sometimes because it's not going into that filter, preemptively. And then when we do get it, we want to translate it into the thing that makes sense for us to be able to decide upon it or evaluate it.
I think that's a really good point. And in fact, I would say that that's kind of a core principle with all preferences, is almost like we're converters for the preferences that we have, meaning that if I'm a thinker and I'm taking in emotional information, I'm going to try to translate it into a digital information because that's what's easier for me to understand. All the other dichotomies are the same, right? If I take in sensory information, I'm going to try to translate it into an intuitive understanding. Or if I'm in a sensory place, or a person who has sensory preferences is going to take intuitive information and try to convert them to sensory information. The same thing with feelers, right? If a feeler is taking in digital thinker information, they're going to try to convert it to a feeling space because that's what we understand the best. And so there's a lot of interpretation happening. There's a lot of translation happening between things. And I have observed that between you and I. In fact, we just recently had a moment where I needed to get something done in work, like I had to perform a task. And I had a lot of agitated emotions living underneath, things that will probably take me a while to process. And you instinctively, as a feeler, wanted to help me through that. And you showed care and concern for me. And I'm like, listen, man, I can't be in this feeling space and get things done. I got to totally ignore, I got to compartmentalize those emotions. If I stop to pay attention to them, it won't just be a temporary processing thing. This is going to take a while. And I've noticed on the opposite side, when you have emotions you need to process, when you're in a feeling space, I have a tendency to show up and start to do my thinking problem solving. Well, have you taken this into consideration? And how do I translate it to what are next steps? And let's problem solve. And sometimes you're like, I just need to feel the feeling, okay?
I don't want my problem solved. I just need you to listen.
That's
how
right.
I feel.
Right. Well, it's kind of a stereotype, but there's a reason for it, right?
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
not to say that you don't also want problem solving, and not to say that I don't also really appreciate when you show up in a feeling way and help me process my emotions. In fact, I would say that we very much deeply appreciate these qualities in each other, and to some extent have access to the other side as well. I would actually honestly say you're a better problem solver than I am, a person who can help somebody sort of deal with their emotions. I do try to hold space, but I think that you have a clear, competitive advantage over me.
Fair enough.
And that said, I do think that there is also we have wheelhouses, right? I'm definitely more on the thinker side, and you're definitely more on the feeler side when it comes to those kinds of things. And I would say that in our relationship, the preferences have become so obvious. And I've always been in relationships with feelers for the most part, so I've seen these preferences show up over and over again. But I like the intimacy that our relationship brings, so I can really hone in on some of these distinctions.
So something that happens with thinkers and feelers, I think, as we move through the world as people, because we want things on our terms so much, we tend to cluster topically. If you go into a feeling-based industry, let's say something like human resources or healthcare or maybe hospitality, you tend to find a cluster of feelers attracted to that industry, maybe for career or interest, because they feel comfortable flowing with people and people's emotions and needs and the hospitality and all these things. And then you go to another industry, maybe it's technology, like computer coding or infrastructure or what am I thinking of?
Engineering.
Engineering.
Anything in STEM.
Yeah, anything in STEM. It's a cluster of thinkers, typically. And one of the things that I think would be really cool in the world is for more thinkers to enter these quote-unquote feeling spaces and industries. I think there's a big chunk of help and resource and offering that we're missing in a lot of areas of life because not enough thinkers are engaged in those more human-centered places because we need thought there, right? And I think in the STEM world, and we're seeing a big push on this in recent years, we're looking for more feelers to be over on those harder sciences, the things that where thinkers tend to cluster. And I think feeling really needs to be represented there, so it's not just all digital ones and zeros in these spaces. What can happen, though, when people start to enter those is it almost feels like your turf is being stepped on. And there's some defensiveness that comes up from us as humans. You're in the HR department and a thinker comes in to start to work there, as an example, or maybe a service industry or hospitality industry or even healthcare. All of a sudden, it's this person's bad and wrong. They're not doing it the way that's the right way. The right way is a feeler way to go about helping people. That's how you actually do this job. Or on the other side, maybe a feeler entering a more thinker space like STEM. Maybe it's computer coding or some kind of hard science or some way of technology or engineering. And they're like, that's not the thinker way of doing things. You're bringing too much emotion and feeling into this space. That's not the way it's done here. So I've seen actually areas of life tend to categorize around thinking and feeling, and they cluster people that are interested in those things. And it's exciting to see industries that allow the other to come in, areas of life that allow the other to come in. I think it adds a richness, and there's so much more variety, much more dimension and dynamic elements that come in when you add the other to a cluster.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's another variation of what you're talking about too, which is that a feeler enters a quote unquote thinker space or thinker turf, and then tries to get the thinker turf to change to suit them. And I've seen the opposite too. The thinker enters a feeler space and tries to change that turf to suit them. And so I agree with you. I think having a broader spectrum in each of these industries, or these territories that have traditionally been sort of overwhelmingly, thinker or feeler, I think that having people who have the opposite preferences but still a natural interest. So there are thinkers that have more of a natural interest in the humanities, and there are feelers that have a natural interest in more hard sciences. That absolutely happens. And when they enter those industries or those spaces, they bring something that prevents those industries from becoming too one-sided. They shed light on maybe some of the shadows of those industries. I think that's really important. As long as they don't try to change the industry to suit them, right? They bring a texture and flavor to it. They shouldn't get the industry to try to bend the knee to their will or their preferences. I think that can sometimes be a challenge. But when that tension is balanced, when they're bringing the other side with a natural interest to this place, I think that they can add so much wisdom and insight to these different industries.
But I feel like 4 + 4 is 5.
Yeah.
I just really feel 4 + 4 is 5.
Right.
It should be true because I feel it so strongly.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, that's, there can be conversation and philosophy around that, but it's not hard science, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that there is something to be said for really building an appreciation and an honor for the other side of the preference. I mean, I almost think that thinker and feeler in some ways, introvert, extrovert, there can be some animus there. Sometimes introverts get a little salty with extroverts because they're loud, or at least that's the perception, because the most obvious extroverts are going to be really loud. There's a ton of extroverts out there that are not loud, but we're always paying attention to the ones that insist we pay attention to them. And so sometimes introverts get a little salty about extroverts being that way. And I think that sometimes intuitives, if they feel like they've not really been, maybe taken into consideration that they're thinking very differently, or they're raised in a context that didn't make space for them, they can get a little salty with sensors. But I would say that thinkers and feelers, almost without even knowing it, have some of the highest tension between each other. And it probably is because this is the point of origin for our decision-making processes. These are the shoulds of life. Like I build beliefs around how reality should be constructed based on this preference. And so when somebody is doing something very different from me, it's easy to take it personally. Well, what are you saying? That I don't see reality right? That I haven't come to the right conclusions? That my evaluation criteria isn't accurate, or isn't the correct one, or isn't the most helpful? And I think really building an appreciation for what the other side of this brings and what they have to offer is, first of all, one of the best ways to not be one-sided, because I see one-sidedness really showing up in the thinking and feeling preferences. I see thinkers who just maybe feel socially awkward, or feel like they have a hard time connecting with other people, have a hard time connecting with themselves. They just go, well, I guess I don't really need feelings. And then they shove them down and they repress them and deprioritize them and have this abstract idea that someday I'm going to stop kicking this can down the road and pay attention to my emotions, or pay attention to the social component of interpersonal dynamics. And I see feelers kick cans down the road too. But I think when a feeler is kicking a can down a road, I think it's more like contending with a belief system, or getting their career up and going. Like there's a procrastination to doing harder thinker work Because it's like, well, I mean, I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing. I don't know what career I'm supposed to be in. It's like, well, start grinding it out, and maybe the path itself will sort of present itself in front of you. And it's like, well, I don't really want to do things until I know what I want to do. Or, I was raised this certain religion, or I was raised this certain way of looking at reality or paradigm, this certain political position, and it's not really feeling exactly accurate, but it seems like that's a powder cake if I really start deep diving into that. So I think I'm just going to keep kicking that can and just be happy that I get to be around my friends and family. So there is definitely thinker work that gets procrastinated as well as feeler work. And when you are procrastinating that work, it's really easy to almost feel when you're in the presence of somebody who has that as a preference. Like you're procrastinating thinker work and you're now around a thinker. It can be very easy to feel like that person is reminding you of work that you are procrastinating, work that you should be doing that you're not doing, and then just generally get annoyed by them and build a story about how that person is not doing things right or well. And the opposite can be true. Sometimes when you're a thinker and you're putting off your emotional work, you're putting off maybe emotional processing from, experiences you had in the past, or you're putting off your social skills and the need to build those social skills to have relationships. And a person with feeling preferences shows up and it seems so effortless for them. It seems like they're a natural at it and it's super easy. It can be, the thinker can take that on as some sort of, statement of incompetence, and then they just don't even want to look at it, and they push that away. So when we are allowing ourselves to be one-sided, it is really easy to diminish the value of the other side of this preference, of the other side, this dichotomy, without recognizing that people who are representing that side might they themselves be helping you, right? Like they might be your salvation. They might be the person who helps guide you through this space, not to remind you you're not doing it, but to actually help you get through the things that you need to do. And so that real appreciation helps us visit the other side, look at the things that are in our shadow that this other person or people might be able to cast light on. And instead of pushing them away, because you're pushing your own portion of yourself in this dimension away, instead embrace it and go, oh, this might be a person who can help me navigate through this darker terrain. And that is something I've been seeking. I think that building appreciation for the other side of this dichotomy is pretty critical as people, actually.
I think it's necessary sooner than we realize, because there's two big energies on the planet right now. There's the energy of technology progression. So technology is doubling very fast. Was it Moore's law, right? It just keeps doubling on a faster rate, growth curve. As well as globalization is the other massive energy. And I would argue that technology really is, if you had to give like thinker feeler like stewardship over things, I think technology is in the province of thinkers. Now, I mean, obviously I access technology as a feeler. I'm not saying feelers can't engage with technology. I'm just saying it's like energetically, if you like zoom way out, like in a very intuitive, abstract way, thinking and technology are related. Like they're kind of in the same energy field. And I would say feeling and globalization is related in a really abstract, zoomed out way. In other words, people groups, as we globalize, we're rubbing shoulders with each other. And then there's the tension between technology and globalization. So obviously technology advancing creates more globalization. In other words, I can tweet to somebody or send a message to somebody on the other side of the world, and they can hear that message when I send it because of technology. And technology also, we're using it to help solve some of our people challenges. And so I actually think that we're going to need each other more than ever, thinkers and feelers, because the world's getting more globalized and more technologically advanced every day. And we feelers and thinkers are going to have to learn how to navigate these energies, right? And kind of show up together, work together, because this is not going to happen without cooperation and understanding of each other. We will be right back. If you're focused on personal growth, I think you'll resonate with our core content over at personalityhacker.com. We want to see you understand how your mind is wired so you can generate motivation, improve social skills, find career opportunities, and master excellent decision making. But a quick warning, we are advice and action focused in all of our articles, podcasts, and videos. This means that we attract people who like to be challenged to become excellent, to take action, to put in the work to optimize themselves, not simply just gather more information. If you are committed to personal growth and ready to radically find your inner truth, then come over and be a part of our growing community of like minds at Personality Hacker. Now back to the show.
I think globalization is such a fascinating way to understand thinking and feeling as a dichotomy. Because globalization, I think most people see this as like almost a political term or a technological term, interestingly enough. But globalization, or the ability to be interconnected with all these other parts of the planet, basically as people, as human groups, which is why I believe you accurately diagnosed it as being more in the feeler space, because it is more about people and their interconnectedness with each other. But it's built on top of technology. Like globalization is able to happen because the technological piece acts as a platform to make it happen. And so the idea, I think, really between these two things, as like I mentioned as a nucleus, is that the thinking side is more concerned with the platform. And the feeling side is more concerned with the human experience that lives on top of that platform. So there is that one degree of separation that thinkers have from the personal experience, which means that it almost feels like they're not that emotional. And I suspect that a lot of thinkers self-define that way, that they're not that emotional, that they don't really feel emotions that clearly, or they don't know what they're feeling or other people are feeling. And it's because when you have a thinking preference and you get a little bit of mental real estate, you're not paying attention to the emotional component. You're paying attention to more of that platform component, the systems, the thoughts, the beliefs, that sort of thing.
Well, and I think that this, we were talking about the categories of like industries where thinkers and feelers cluster. I mean, these energies, they cluster too, right? You can almost see like, I mean, if you wanted to look at it through a political lens or something like this, like the EU, the European Union, setting, because it's globalization, people are coming together as people groups bumping against each other. They're setting rules for technology companies because the technology is growing so fast. They're trying to throttle the technology for people reasons, right? And then technologists are saying, wait a minute, don't now you're inhibiting growth. Like we want to grow and get bigger and expand more. And so there's almost like this giant energetic war between these two factions in a way. And I think that we're going to have to get the tension point right? It can't be one side or the other. It's like, who's going to win out in the end of the day? Is it going to be super regulated and tightened down, or is it going to be just a free-for-all and expansive endlessly and people are going to get hurt? Well, neither one's going to be a good option. So which tension wins, or how do we find a tension point as people between these two broad energies rather than having, wars over it? And by the way, one of the reasons we're talking about thinking and feeling in so many conflict terms or balancing of tensions or these elements is because the thinking and the feeling are what's technically called our judging processes. These are the ways that we judge, not in a judging versus perceiver element, but these are the ways we judge or evaluate the should statements of life, what we should be doing, what is the right choice to make, what is the logical choice to make, what works, what get people's needs met, what all these different criteria come in. So often conflict lives in thinking and feeling. Now, there can be some conflict in the worldview we have, the perceptions we have, if we're not seeing eye to eye, but most of our conflict as humans sits in this dichotomy. And it can be feeler versus feeler. It's not just feeler versus thinker, but I think it's an easy way to see how conflict and decisions and evaluative criteria show up, a thinker versus a feeler, because it's so obvious.
Right. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why we keep saying we need to build appreciation for the other side, because it's very easy to have conflict in this space. And that idea that, I really feel like this concept of seeing the different energies or stewardships that we feel as when we have feeler or thinker preferences, the parts of reality that we believe that we need to be advocating in behalf. Like feelers have a tendency to want to be advocates of the personal experience, right? Either it's their own, right? I'm allowed to feel my feelings. I should be able to validate my emotional experience or my personal experience. Others should be validating my personal experience because it is a human experience. Or the idea of prioritizing interpersonal relationships and how we're impacting each other. Like you mentioned, the EU, like throttling technology in behalf of humans. And this is going to probably become more and more relevant as population density increases and there's more people to be, to take into consideration. And then on the other side, you've got thinkers who are paying attention to more of those systems for the most part. And I think feelers can sometimes misattribute that one degree of separation that thinkers have from the human experience as being cold or uncaring, or they don't care about how they're impacting people at all. And thinkers can look at feelers and think that they're myopic, that they're paying attention to only one or two things, that there's a lot of things to be taken into consideration here. And to some extent, the accusations that fly back and forth, and there's a lot of variations of accusations of you're cold or you're myopic, there's some truth to them, actually, right? And that's a natural byproduct of being a steward, that you are going to over-focus on certain components, and that's your job. Your job is to hyper-focus on certain things and make sure that they're represented in the world. And the benefit to a thinker being a little cold, a little distant, a little removed, is that these platforms exist. Because if you're hyper-focused on the human experience, there's a lot of things that need to get done that people aren't that happy about, that people, they fight against, or they think that this shouldn't happen, or, what about how somebody is going to respond to this, right? And if that's highest priority for you and you're constantly and perpetually taking that into consideration, then nothing's ever really going to be done. Not really. That isn't a social system. Logistical systems require us to move forward even if people are salty about it. And then whole systems get built, and those create the platforms that other people can then be salty about those systems. I mean, I think about how many people on social media complain about the modern world on their phones that were built for them through systems that were created by and large by thinkers, right? And they get to talk about their feelings to a broad audience of people on a platform that thinkers built. And thinkers built it because they're not constantly and perpetually thinking about the human experience. You can't do both of those things simultaneously. So there are major advantages to having thinking preferences represented in the world. On the other side, if those thinking preferences are getting you your results, and they're getting results more, like you're getting better results, more results, you're hitting your goals and targets faster and better by completely ignoring people, well, then now this is why the feeler voice has to be heard, because you can get so one-sided, so far over on that preference side, that dichotomy of thinker side, that you get further and further and further removed from the results of your actions and how they impact people. And you lose that tether. You lose that reality that you're not allowed to just do whatever you want to and justify it by making things happen and getting things done. There are people who are impacted by this, and that needs to be taken into consideration. Like your bottom line dollar number, or your bottom line, like how many rungs up the ladder you were able to climb, or projects and goals you're able to get done, if it doesn't take into account how it's impacting other people, then there's a sense that you kind of lost touch with humanity, because there's really nobody who cares how much money you have. I mean, yes, you have power then, but at the end of your days, there's a spiritual bankruptcy that is woven in when you lose touch with how things are impacting other humans. Like the ROI must include that component. Otherwise, you're not actually taking in a bigger picture. You're just as myopic as the feelers that you're trying to distance yourself from. You're just myopic in the polar opposite way. And so feelers absolutely have to be represented, because they remind the platform makers that the platforms exist for humans, right? Not for metrics. They're not, the metrics are not intrinsic. It's not like the metrics are benefiting from the world you're building. Like the metrics are like, oh, we get to exist now. Like they're not conscious. They're not aware. The dollar points in your bank account don't care that they exist and are growing. So when you lose touch with the human component, or I have a bunch of power, and it's like, to what end? I have a bunch of money. Okay, to what end? I'm the smartest person in the room. Okay, but to what end? I think amazing thoughts. So, right? Do you have relationships? Do you care about other humans? And that's why it ends up becoming spiritually bankrupt. And it becomes way one-sided unless a feeler comes along and goes, you know that you're like emotionally and spiritually bankrupt, right? You know that you have no meaning in this life other than just, getting more and more digits on a computer screen, which doesn't have any meaning or value in and of itself. And so you have to have the feeling side be a little quote unquote myopic about the human experience, because they're advocates to make sure that that's being taken into consideration. And you can talk about this on a global macro level, and you can zoom all the way into a family dynamic where you've got thinkers and feelers within a smaller unit of people that are interacting, engaging. And the feeler goes, hey, like the decisions we make impact everybody, so maybe we should take them into consideration. And a thinker might go, well, then those people just have to suck it up, right? Because this is what we're doing. And in that kind of situation, the feeler's, feedback is absolutely crucial to the thinker if they've gotten further and further removed from that human element. By the same token, if the feelers are only thinking about human impact, well, then what systems are we going to build? Like, what kind of home are we going to have, and where are we going to live, and what's the career path we're going to take, and how are we going to pay our bills, and how's that all going to look? What are our belief systems going to be? What are our paradigms? What are we going to teach our kids? And all of those things have to be represented. And you can see when they're, as you mentioned, Joel, in a good tension point, when both sides are being taken into consideration, people are the happiest. They're the most rested into themselves when they integrate the other side. So I think it's really important to understand why the nucleus can actually get us further and further away from our purpose. If you understand the nucleus of these things, then you can understand the importance of bringing them together and having a tension point where I would argue, as a general statement, neither side gets to have it weighted towards them. Neither side gets to be overrepresented, except contextually. Moment to moment, this might be a thinker situation. Moment to moment, this might be a feeler situation. But then our set point goes back to attention right in the middle of the two.
Remember, we're talking about energies in the abstract. So when Antonia said, people on the phone, messaging on this phone that the thinkers built, clearly there were feelers involved in building the technologies we have. She's not saying that feelers or people that have feeling preferences don't have a technological bent, can't have thought, can't be part of technology. And we're certainly not saying that thinkers can't be part of globalization or thinking about policy or human connection or human dynamics. There's often people of both types on these sides of these energies. We're just talking about in the abstract to give a sense of it. And one of the challenges in talking about this, we kind of have to keep it abstract and energy level. Number one, we want these podcasts, when you listen to this 10, 20, 30 years from now, we want it to be relevant. So we try to talk about principles, energies, and abstractions, because if we give specific examples, even the EU example, it may not exist in 10 years. I don't know. Like, even any example we give may not exist in the future. So we're time binding it and we're making it maybe not accessible if we bring it down to specific topics. And then the other thing is, this is our judging process, right? Our thinking or our feeling is how we make evaluative criteria. There's a lot of strong feelings and thoughts about the topics we might bring up to give you good examples, a specific example about these things in the real world. And so we're trying to keep this in an abstraction so that you don't latch onto the topic and debate or feel strongly about a topic specifically. You can just see the intention of what we're saying at the higher level. I would like to try to bring it down a little bit more concrete. And I think you did a good job, Antonia, because I think the family unit or personal dynamics between more individual people, the moment you take it out of big groups and you bring it down more to families or individuals, I think we can get more specific, because it's often not topical there. It's often, usually it's more between people or between thought processes. So if we come down to that and we think in terms of like, as a feeler raised maybe in a thinker world, let's just talk about that, because maybe you're a feeler right now and you're listening along. We've been in the abstract. Let's bring it down to a tangible level. For you as a feeler in the thinker world, let's say you have to be a lot in a thinker world, just understand the people around you are not necessarily, if they have thinking preferences, going to the human experience first. It's so obvious to you. I mean, I'm a feeler as well. It's so obvious to you that the human experience matters. people's emotions matter. It's amazing to you when somebody maybe that doesn't have feeling preferences says something to another person, and you're like, man, that hurts their feelings. Why they're not taking that into consideration, not thinking about that. No, they're not often. They're thinking about other things. They're not necessarily thinking about the human impact. Now, through training and maturity and understanding type and all this, a thinker can certainly have an empathy and understanding of how they're impacting other people. But it's not like that's the natural wiring of their mind. And if you flip this and you're a thinker in a feeling environment, and you're like, can we stop making emotions so heavy and prioritizing everybody's feelings all the time? This doesn't make any sense. Like, I just want to transfer this thought from me to you, and you got to emotionally bring all this mess in here all the time. Well, understand the feelers around you are definitely encoding things and how it's striking them and striking other people. And the human experience and the human component is so, I mean, it's a desire, it's a preference to look at it, but it's almost, you can't escape it. It just is. That's how you see the world in a lot of ways. So I think this is just some tangible thoughts around people that are actually living an experience of being a thinker or living an experience of being a feeler in the world itself.
Yeah, and I do want to mention, at least at some point before this podcast completes, that we're not saying that thinkers aren't emotional, and we're not saying that feelers aren't intellectually gifted. There are plenty of feelers that are really intelligent and do a lot of, I think, do a lot of thinking. I would say they're thoughtful people. They ruminate, they take data into consideration. And there are plenty of thinkers who tap into their emotional experience or believe that that's important to do emotional processing. And they do what they can to observe that part of who they are. By the same token, there are a lot of thinkers who, even if they are one-sided, will get emotionally attached to things that they don't even realize they're emotionally attached to. Like, thinkers can sometimes get emotionally attached to their beliefs, being right? Like having the best thoughts, being the smartest person in the room. And that's oftentimes ego attachment. And ego attachment can show up in a variety of emotional ways. And so thinkers can sometimes be quite emotional and almost be blind to the fact that they're emotional because this is something that they're not paying attention to. So it's a phenomena happening to them without their conscious awareness. And I would argue on the other side, there are feelers who can be in a corollary position, but with thoughts. They think they're thinking. They think that they're being really deep and taking thoughts into consideration. But really, they are disproportionately attached to information that's quite corrupt or information that is influencing them to make decisions that are actually far more irrational than they give them credit for. And so they're unconscious around the low quality of their information and data. Or I would actually say, maybe even on that side, they have a disrespect for information and thought, that they don't believe that they have to honor it, that information is there to be exploited for their own purposes as opposed to be honored for the thing that it is. And this would be like a thinker not honoring emotions. It would be like a thinker that just sees emotions as a way to, to be exploitative or manipulative. And this can happen. And that's the biggest challenge with the one-sidedness, is that when you don't have respect for the other side and you don't honor it, now you're able to exploit it. Now it's just there as a manipulation tool. Now it's just there. And you can see this, like thinkers that are highly emotional but without being consciously aware of it will use other people's emotional information to try to manipulate them into doing things. They'll notice that shame is a big one, right? Shame is a really good tactic. So they'll start using like sort of these overarching gross emotions to manipulate another person to make them feel bad, right? Like you're stupid, or I'm smarter than you, or even just more subtle emotions, like, well, I guess you're not a very good mom then, or whatever, knowing that this works, this gets them their goal. And that's when you don't have respect for emotions, not really, when you're using them against another person. And feelers can do this too, by the way, but thinkers will do it without really having a lot of awareness around it. And feelers on the other side can do this with information. And you can see this with like a lot of, when a feeler engages in what's called straw man or straw manning, when they take the weakest part of somebody else's argument and then try to represent that as their full argument and then tell them why they're wrong, when really the person themselves, the feeler themselves, has not done their due diligence in really thinking this through. They haven't shown enough respect for the information and data to be able to go, okay, well, I understand why a person would feel that way or think that way. I'm going to meet you halfway with this, with your thinking. Instead of doing that, they use it to project onto the other person that they're a bad person. Anybody who would think this must be a bad person for thinking this. And so information is weaponized then. So the real importance of seeing the beauty and the power of the other side, understanding the distinction here, and then making peace and integrating the other side is so crucial and important, because both of these things are so powerful. Both thoughts and emotions are powerful weapons in the wrong hands, but they're also very powerful tools in the right hand. And so making peace with it, integrating the other side, understanding what your preference is, and then understanding the importance and respecting and honoring the other component, having that tension be in the middle as a set point, I think it's a massive leverage point. I think it's a huge leverage point, maybe not in quote unquote saving the world. I don't think anybody can save the world, but in ourselves, like if in our worlds, in our like us going through the world, when we make this really beautiful connection inside of ourselves, I think it has a very powerful impact on the quality of our lives.
I alluded to it earlier, I think near the beginning of the podcast. I'll just make a quick mention of this before we wrap up today, that there are actually two styles of feelers, and there's two styles of thinkers. And we're not going to really get into much of that today, but if you're a new listener and you're just listening about the thinking and feeling dichotomy, your XXTX, whatever that is, or XXFX, meaning you're a feeler or a thinker, just understand there's two styles of these. So maybe you don't resonate with some of the ways the description of feeling is written about online. Maybe you're reading articles, you're like, I feel emotional, but I'm not resonating with the way this person or this website or this thing is articulating feeling. Or maybe thinking. I'm not, I'm a thinker, but I'm not resonating with the style of thinking that this person is talking about. Well, just understand there's two different styles. And if we go one layer deep below the dichotomies, which is that 4-letter code of your personality, we're now talking about what's technically called cognitive functions. And this is the wiring of your mind. This is the way your mind makes decisions and learns information. And so if you make decisions as a feeler, you're going to be using one of two styles of feeling. And if you make decisions as a thinker, you're going to be using one of two styles of thinking. And again, we've got tons of podcast recordings talking about this, but I just want to make that mention because there's more nuance. The rabbit hole goes way deeper below the surface of just this dichotomy level. I wanted to make mention of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And to piggyback off on that, they're feeling and thinking preferences that are pointed either towards the inner world or the outer world. So the feeling functions would have an either inner world expression, which is called introverted feeling. We call it authenticity. And then there's an external world experience of feeling, which is extroverted feeling. We call it harmony. For the thinking, there's an internalized thinking preference, which is introverted thinking. We call it accuracy. And then there's an external world thinking preference pointed to the outer world, which is extroverted thinking, and we call it effectiveness. So if you want to go down those rabbit hole, like Joel mentioned, we highly recommend looking up those specific functions and getting an idea for how they look. But this podcast was focused on trying to get to the nucleus of these two sides, and what it really ended up being was an advocacy for both sides. Regardless of which style of thinking and feeling you personally use or prefer, there are three others that exist, right? Decision-making criteria that exist out there. And so getting a real appreciation for those other three styles, like take, for example, I use introverted thinking or accuracy, but building an appreciation for the extroverted version of thinking and the two feeling styles, game changer for me. All of a sudden, my single worldview really broadened, and I started to understand how important it was to have these other components in there. So we just want to reiterate that appreciation for the other side, if you're looking at it at a dichotomy level, or an appreciation for all the different styles of judgment or evaluation, is really critical for making peace with people, for not asserting your own worldview in a way that overvalues your own experience, in a way that sort of understands what the other side has to offer, and that we need all of them represented in the ecosystem. This is the place that the most conflict comes up, in my experience, but as we mentioned earlier, also the most appreciation. Joel and I started out by saying this is the place where we fight, but it's also the place that we have extraordinary admiration for the other person and what they're bringing. And so if you really want to get through a lot of conflicts and try to diagnose them and figure out why you're fighting with people and why you can't understand where they're coming from and why there's so many language clashes, really getting an appreciation for this dichotomy and the different styles within can be a game changer, as well as learning to integrate the other side within yourself. Equally a game changer.
So what do you think? You've been hanging out with us. You haven't had a microphone, but you've been here in this podcast and in this conversation. We want to hear from you. Come over to personalityhacker.com directly below this episode. Leave a comment, ask a question, or more importantly, share your story. Are you a feeler? Are you a thinker? What's your experience been like? I'm a feeler, so I'm asking for the human experience of it. Or the data set for the thinkers out there. What's the data set of your experience in life? Come over to personalityhacker.com and make your voice heard. I want to hear from you.
Yeah. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. If you leave us a rating and review on iTunes, that helps us out a lot. I don't think we've had a review for a little while. So if you'd throw a review up, that would be tasty. Go leave a rating and review. We have a book. It's called Personality Hacker. You can get it at all major book retailers. And if you leave us a rating and review on Goodreads or on Amazon, that also helps us out a lot. We have personal growth programs through the lens of personality type available at our website. So if you want to take your personal growth to the next level, head over to personalityhacker.com, look at our catalog of programs, and see which one is right for you at this moment in the timeline.
Yeah, talking and thinking about thinking and feeling. We have 2 programs for INs in the Myers-Briggs system, INFJs and INFPs. We have a program called Empowered, designed specifically for your 2 types to amplify and grow your personality. We also have one for INTJs and INTPs called INTX Unleashed. And these programs are really great programs to pour gasoline on your personal growth journey as one of these 4 types. So go check those out, because I really just want to direct you to something specific this week around thinking and feeling. And we know that those 4 types have a lot of challenges, unique challenges in the world. They're more rare types. And so we've really wanted to speak to them and give them some help and resources. And if you're one of these types, check those over at personalityhacker.com. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast. If you're focused on personal growth, I think you'll resonate with our core content over at personalityhacker.com. We want to see you understand how your mind is wired so you can generate motivation, improve social skills, find career opportunities, and master excellent decision making. But a quick warning, we are advice and action focused in all of our articles, podcasts, and videos. This means that we attract people who like to be challenged to become excellent, to take action, to put in the work to optimize themselves, not simply just gather more information. If you are committed to personal growth and ready to radically find your inner truth, then come over and be a part of our growing community of like minds at Personality Hacker.